For over 50 years, one question has haunted investigators. Who was the Zodiac killer? One of the suspects we're covering today passed multiple lie detector tests and was cleared by police, until decades later when new evidence emerged that changed everything. Welcome to True Crime Explorers. Today we're diving into the 10 most compelling theories about the Zodiac killer's true identity, from obscure suspects you've never heard of to the names that dominated headlines. Between December 1968 and October 1969, a killer terrorized Northern California, claiming at least 5 confirmed victims, though he boasted of 37 in cryptic letters. The Zodiac taunted police with ciphers, some still unsolved today. A note before we begin: this case involves real victims: Betty Lou Jensen, David Faraday, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stein. We'll discuss this case with the respect it deserves. 10. Jack Tarrance. Jack Tarrance was a San Francisco resident with a public fixation on codes and ciphers. He matched the physical description, frequented Lake Berryessa where Cecilia Shepard and Brian Hartnell were attacked, and obsessively collected newspaper clippings about the case. But there's no physical evidence linking him to any crime scene, no DNA, no definitive handwriting match. Tarrance died in 2006. The case against him entirely circumstantial, a warning about how easy it is to see the Zodiac in anyone interested in cryptography. While Tarrance was a nobody who caught investigators' eyes by coincidence, our next suspect actively inserted himself into the investigation. 9. Richard Gaikowski. Richard Gaikowski was a journalist for The Good Times, an underground San Francisco newspaper. The Zodiac sent letters to newspapers exactly like his. He lived in San Francisco during the murders, moved to New York in 1970 after the Zodiac's last confirmed letter, and resembled the police sketch. In 2009, a voice analyst compared Gaikowski's voice to a 1969 recording of someone claiming to be the Zodiac. The probability of a match was extremely high, one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the case, yet Gaikowski was never officially investigated. He died in 2004, never charged because voice analysis alone isn't enough for conviction. If Gaikowski was too close to the media, our next suspect had a violent history that made him impossible to ignore. 8. Lawrence Kane K. Lawrence Kane had a history of violence against women. After a 1962 brain injury, his personality reportedly changed drastically. He lived near victim Darlene Ferrin. Witnesses reported seeing them together. He worked near several attack sites and moved frequently throughout Northern California during the killing spree. After victim Kathleen Johns claimed she escaped an abduction in 1970, she identified Kane from a photo lineup, yet he was never arrested. Kane died in 2010. The circumstantial evidence is substantial, but there's no definitive proof. Kane's violent tendencies made him a natural suspect, but our next theory suggests the Zodiac might have been hiding in the most unlikely place. 11. Ross Sullivan. Ross Sullivan worked at Riverside City College Library, where Sherry Jo Bates was murdered in 1966. While Bates isn't officially a Zodiac victim, the killer sent letters bearing striking similarities to later Zodiac communications. Sullivan was a loner obsessed with cryptograms who resembled the sketch and wore military-style boots similar to prints found at Lake Berryessa. He disappeared from his job the day after Bates was murdered. When he returned weeks later, colleagues said he seemed paranoid and withdrawn. Sullivan was diagnosed with schizophrenia and died in 1977 at just 36. The Riverside Police Department has never officially connected Bates to the Zodiac, leaving Sullivan in limbo, a compelling suspect for a crime that might not even be part of the series. While Sullivan's story involves disputed murders, our next suspect brings us to a theory that gained serious traction in recent years. 6. Earl Van Best Jr. In 2014, Gary Stewart published a book claiming his biological father, Earl Van Best Jr., was the Zodiac. Stewart's evidence? Van Best's handwriting appeared to match the Zodiac letters. He lived in San Francisco during the murders and had a criminal record. Stewart hired forensic examiners who claimed the handwriting matched. The theory gained enough attention for a documentary series. But when San Francisco police investigated, they found no credible evidence. DNA testing excluded Van Best as a match to the Paul Stein crime scene. Van Best died in 1984, and while Stewart's search is deeply personal, most experts consider this theory debunked. Van Best's story shows how badly we want to solve this case, but our next suspect represents a completely different theory. 5. The multiple killers theory. What if the Zodiac wasn't one person? Some investigators propose the confirmed attacks might have been committed by different killers, copycats inspired by media coverage, or accomplices working together. The MO varied significantly. Lake Herman Road was an ambush. Blue Rock Springs used different weapons. Lake Berryessa involved a costume and knife. Paul Stein's murder was execution style in a completely different setting. Handwriting experts noted subtle differences in letters over time. If you're finding these theories as compelling as I am, hit that like button. The counter-argument? The ciphers show consistent cryptography knowledge. The letters contain details only the killer would know. Most investigators believe one killer is more likely than an elaborate conspiracy. Whether one killer or many, our next suspect is someone police actually zeroed in on early. 4. Donald Lee Bujock. Visual sketch and photo comparison of Donald Lee Bujock. Donald Lee Bujock's name surfaced through former police dispatcher Lyndon Lafferty. Bujock had military cryptography training, lived in California during the killings, and bore a striking resemblance to the composite sketch. Visual timeline showing Bujock's movements. Lafferty believed Bujock's handwriting matched the Zodiac letters and found evidence placing him in the right locations at the right times. But once again, no physical evidence, no DNA match, no definitive proof. Bujock died in 1993 before thorough investigation. Transition. Bujock had the skills, but our next suspect had something potentially more damning. A personal connection. 3. Richard Marshall. Visual photo of Richard Marshall. Richard Marshall allegedly knew at least one victim personally. He worked in Vallejo, had connections placing him near crime scenes, worked night shifts giving him freedom during attack times, and had knowledge of the targeted areas. Visual map of Vallejo with locations marked. Marshall represents the terrifying possibility that the Zodiac was someone on the periphery of victims' lives, not a stranger, but someone who knew the area intimately. Marshall died in the 1980s, another suspect who slipped away before modern forensics could rule him in or out. Transition. Marshall represents the terrifying familiar possibility, but our next suspect was someone police kept coming back to. 2. Arthur Lee Allen. Visual multiple photos of Arthur Lee Allen. If you know anything about the Zodiac case, you know this name. Arthur Lee Allen is the most famous suspect, investigated repeatedly from 1971 until his death in 1992. Visual, police surveillance photos, documents. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. He allegedly told friends he wanted to call himself Zodiac before the killings. He wore a Zodiac brand watch. Witnesses placed him near crime scenes. He owned similar weapons. When police searched his home, they found bomb-making materials. He fit the physical description perfectly and worked where victim Darlene Ferrin had been. Visual DNA comparison chart. So why isn't he definitely the Zodiac? DNA evidence. In 2002, partial DNA from a Zodiac letter didn't match Allen. His handwriting didn't match either, though he could have had someone else write letters. Fingerprints from the Paul Stein crime scene didn't match. Visual text excluded by DNA. Still, many investigators believe Allen was the Zodiac, suggesting DNA contamination. The debate continues. Transition. Allen dominated the investigation for decades, but recent developments have turned attention to someone completely different. 1. Gary Francis Post and the modern DNA investigation. Visual recent photo of Gary Francis Post. In October 2021, the casebreakers announced they'd identified the Zodiac, Gary Francis Post, a house painter who died in 2018. Visual casebreakers press conference footage. Their evidence included forensic analysis, deciphered messages allegedly containing Post's name, and witness testimony. They claimed Post resembled sketches, had scars matching witness descriptions, and had been questioned in connection with other murders. Visual, side-by-side comparison photos. But the FBI and San Francisco Police Department haven't confirmed this identification. The case remains open and unsolved. Without official DNA confirmation, post remains another compelling theory, perhaps the most compelling recent one, but not a confirmed solution. Visual DNA analysis imagery, genealogy charts. Visual photos of the 5 confirmed victims, 10 suspects, decades of investigation, and yet officially, the Zodiac's identity remains unknown. Which theory stayed with you the most? Do you think the Zodiac's identity will ever be definitively proven? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. If you want to explore more unsolved mysteries, check out our video on suggested video right here. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We post new deep dives every schedule. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious. Visual end screen with subscribe button. Word count, approximately 1750 words.